Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is David Shea, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm the director of the Center for Charge Card Management in GSA, and we're the people that manage the overall GSA SmartPay program. And so this is the program update, and in this class, I'm going to cover issues, significant issues from the year. And it's been an interesting year, hasn't it? I hope that you and yours are all healthy and safe and that you're enjoying our virtual forum so far. But in this particular class, we deal with issues from the headquarters program-wide level, the big issues that are going on. And most of the focus this year has been in the purchase card area. There'll be a splash of travel addressed in here and fleet, and we'll have a few case studies to touch on towards the end, which I hope will be fun. But the main topics cover purchase and overall spending trends and things like that. So, and if I can get my slides to advance, there we go. So as you know, the program has been operating for over 21 years, supporting agency missions. We're going to walk through these topics here on this agenda. We're going to talk about the spend history of the program, some key statistics, how the program has grown through the years, how you can maximize the value you're getting from the program, because indeed the challenge has become, especially now that we've got the transition to the new SmartPay 3 program kind of fading in the rearview mirror here, is everyone uses the program, but the question is, are you maximizing the benefit that you're getting from it? In most cases, agencies can get even more value out of it in terms of greater refunds, better use of the streamlined business processes and the card data and things like that. So we'll be touching on the President's management agenda, the part of it that deals with SmartPay. We'll be talking about some keys to obtaining greater benefits. We'll be talking about a particular project within GSA itself, where we're drinking our own champagne, so to speak, and looking to push the envelope in the use of GSA SmartPay within GSA itself. We'll go through a refresher on emergency response flexibilities that the card offers, the purchase card. We'll touch on the SmartPay website redesign, which hopefully you've seen, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to check out. We'll talk about COVID micro purchase reporting that we offer, that some agencies have elected to use, and others have not, and then some other recent issues and top news. And then that'll lead us into the commercial platform, which is one of the exciting future and near-term things that purchase card users will be able to use their cards with and further leverage the micro purchase authority that we have out there. We'll talk a bit about the products and services available under the GSA SmartPay 3 program. We'll touch on travel and fleet trends and opportunities, and then, as I mentioned, we'll look at those case studies. So here are some really phenomenal numbers, and if you've been to my presentation before, this is yet another update to it. This is one of my favorite slides, and just shows since the program began in the late 1990s, just how much spend and transactions and refunds. So over $500 billion in spend through almost 2 billion transactions have generated over 4.4 billion in agency refunds. And this is through fiscal 19. And those refunds can be reinvested in supporting mission delivery. So, you know, congratulations to you and your cardholders for all the hard work that you've done and that you're going to do. If you're new as part of the SmartPay family, welcome. If you've been working the program for years, you know what I've been talking about. It's just tremendous, the benefits that the program provides, in many cases simply by choosing a different way to pay. As you can see, most of the refunds are generated by the purchase card program. Most of the spend is in the purchase card program. Travel would be second to that. and then fleet would be third. And so we're just beginning on the SmartPay 3 program. Very exciting. It will service the federal government through fiscal year 2031 if all options are exercised. And transitions are always an interesting experience, but thanks to many of you, we've got it done. And certainly all the wonderful support from my staff, and we're really starting to move forward here in a good way. So again, really appreciate everything everyone's doing. So let's look at fiscal 19 in a little bit more detail. You can see there was $32.5 billion worth of spend, which was up just over 6% versus the prior fiscal year. The total transactions were up just slightly to 95.7 million versus fiscal 18. And the total number of accounts, look at that, increased substantially by 21.2% versus FY18. And most of that growth was in the travel card area as agencies deployed even more travel cards. I know on the civilian agency side, in part, a contributing factor to that was a federal travel policy that was issued that kind of tightened the exceptions to travelers having a government travel card. And so agencies were stepping up to address that. But look at that refund number there, 422 million, up 36% over the year before. And that was a record for the program in terms of refunds, and really a heck of a start to the SmartPay 3 program. That level of refund and this level of spending, 32.5 billion across the entire program, was also among the highest in the history of the program. And that occurred during a year where there was still a lot of transition activity going on. So truly just a spectacular, good for government story, and just a great sign of all the good work everyone has been doing in terms of supporting agency mission and the program delivering value. And as I said, there's still opportunity for even more value for your agency, and I think the future is very bright for the program. So we'll talk a bit more on that. In terms of fiscal 20, and this data is through the end of April. We delay it by 90 days, and it's the latest data I have available at this point. You can see year-to-date spend is at 16.7 billion through the end of April, and that's down just over 3%. And the total transactions at 47.5 million, down almost 9.7%. I was going to say almost 10%. So some of what's happening there is the impact of COVID on agency spend, just starting to see that in the April timeframe. Although certainly the cards, particularly the purchase cards, are playing a big role in supporting agencies and responding to this crisis. As you would imagine, travel spend is off significantly for a variety of reasons. Some agencies have restricted travel. In many cases, meetings and conferences and things like that have been canceled. Also, so travel's running on the order of 70, 80% down compared to the prior year. And fleet's spend is also down, as you would imagine, with the government leveraging telework to the maximum extent possible. There's not a lot of as much government vehicle use as there was. So we're also seeing a reduction in fleet. Overall, total program, we're seeing about a 24% reduction at this point. That's purchase, travel, fleet, and integrated combined to this point. But if you step back, and this is more on this historical perspective that I was talking about earlier, is this chart compares SmartPay 1 to SmartPay 2, and of course SmartPay 3 is just getting started. But if you look at the cumulative, let's go to the bottom of this chart, the table, 1.1 billion in refunds earned with SmartPay 1, and it was almost triple that for SmartPay 2. Look at the spend, in terms of 230.9 billion under SmartPay 1, 294 $0.5 billion in SmartPay 2. So significant growth in the program between SmartPay 1 and SmartPay 2, both in terms of transactions, spend, and refunds. And so SmartPay 3, as I say, we're off to a very solid start last year. There is some impact, as I mentioned, due to COVID on the program in fiscal year 20, but we'll continue to move forward. So how do you get more value out of the program? Well, here are some of the key themes that we've been focusing on during 2020, and that is agencies continue to pursue new avenues for using the program or expanding existing avenues. And this is where the President's management agenda and what are known as cross-agency priority goals come into the process. And SmartPay is one of those goals. There are other goals related to example like fleet or EIS or electronic records keeping, things like that. Another key is use of SmartPay for emergency response, and clearly that's been going on this year. SmartPay has always been involved in supporting agencies when there's an emergency. Particularly the purchase cards, well, all of them, travel and fleet, have a role to play in emergencies depending on the scope. And so again, we'll touch a bit on that. And then we're continuing to work through the EAS, the Electronic Access System security issues, make sure the systems are protected from fraudsters and bad actors, working closely with our contractor banks, Citibank and US Bank. And then there's also some information I have to share regarding the fiscal year 18 National Defense Authorization Act, Section 889 issues. And this is where the government is precluded from buying technology from certain Chinese telecommunications and video surveillance firms or their subsidiaries or partners. And that really affects the program in two areas. One area is the master contracts themselves with the banks that GSA manages. And then another area, of course, is what are purchase card holders allowed to buy and not allowed to buy in this area. So you've got twin impacts of this section of the NDAA on the program. And yes, the procurement restrictions or prohibition on buying covered technology from these Chinese firms and their subsidiaries and partners does apply to micro purchases. Okay, micro purchases are not exempt. So let's step back and look at maximizing program use. So an awful lot of the program use, as you would imagine, is in the micro purchase area, which under routine circumstances is $10,000 and below. So in fiscal 19, if we take a look at that, we had $11 billion in spend that was within the micro purchase threshold and $2.3 billion above. And as a percentage of overall government procurement above the micro purchase, that $2.3 billion typically runs about 3 to 4% of what's reported in the federal procurement data system in terms of contract obligations. So when you look at that, hopefully you're going, that's interesting. And it's interesting because, in the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, it talks about that agencies should not limit use of the card solely to micro purchases, that it can also be used for contract payments, payments for delivery orders and task orders and things like that. It's in Part 13 of the FAR. And so there's an opportunity here for your agency in terms of contract payments. I think the first question is, are you leveraging the purchase card for all your micro purchases and earning, your full rebate potential there, right? And the data and enjoying the good controls and things like that. But above and beyond micro purchases, in terms of contract payments, are there opportunities where the card or cardless payment methods under SmartPay could be used to generate even more refunds for your agency. And we've talked about this off and on through the years. I think there are a number of factors coming together now that make this even more significant in terms of something to explore. But it is I believe, a significant additional refund opportunity for your agency. And this is where the president's management agenda comes in. Now, as I mentioned, there's this cross-agency priority goal involving SmartPay, and it's under something called sharing quality services within the president's management agenda. And there are two co-executive sponsors. There's Emily Murphy, who is the GSA administrator, and Maria Rote, who is the deputy federal CIO in the Office of Management and Budget. And basically what this SQS effort is about is government further leveraging successful programs that we know work well. And so SmartPay is one of them. And yeah, I've got a link down here at the bottom of the slide if you want to check out some further information. As I mentioned, there are other programs that are included there. SmartPay is among them. And so we're just going to focus on SmartPay, of course. But see the backdrop here. So in the president's management agenda, similar to what we were just talking about, is the realization that there's this opportunity in the contract spend area beyond micro purchases. So we're not only talking simplified acquisitions, we're also talking full-fledged contracting actions, delivery orders, task orders, things like that. So the key metric that gets applied here is the net increase in use and rebates that an agency would experience. So under the president's management agenda, under this SQS, Sharing Quality Services Initiative, there's been a new role created, and that's the role of what's called a SAPOC. And the SAPOC is a senior accountable point of contact within your agency. If you're in for example, if you're in one of the 24 CFO Act agencies, they each have their own SAPOC. I think there is like a small agency representative as well. But a heads up to the headquarters AOPCs here is that you may be contacted by your SAPOC to get information on your purchase card program and how well it's running, and the opportunities to increase use of the card program to expand refunds in your agency. So how can you really get to these additional benefits? How can you explore them, especially in terms of contract payments? And I think one of the first keys to this is ensuring that your agency card management policies balance support for further use with sensible internal controls. And this is more art than science. In some agencies I've seen, the policies they have are weighted towards internal controls and not so much on encouraging acquisition personnel to make further use of the program. And so that might be something, particularly for headquarters AOPCs with their acquisition policy and their financial policy folks, to take a look at. Is that balance there to make sure that folks within your agency are encouraged to use the card, both on the acquisition side, card holders, people in financial management and management in general are encouraged to explore using the card for contract payments. And this approach could be as simple as asking a contractor, this would be done by your contracting folks, if the contractor would be willing to accept payment by a card. It never hurts to ask. Again, it has to be done by the contracting folks. Some contractors have challenges in getting paid on time. And one of the attractive features, particularly to small business, of being paid with a card is even though they pay a small fee for a card transaction to be processed, that's a fee that's paid by the contractor, not by the government. That vendor or contractor is going to be paid in as early as 1 to 3 days. So from a cash flow perspective, which means a lot to small businesses, this can be very beneficial. Now, from a more comprehensive standpoint, another approach that can be taken is what's called an accounts payable review. And this would normally happen at the headquarters level in your agency. Headquarters AOPC would work with the bank and your financial management personnel to have the bank conduct an accounts payable review. And what this basically is the beginning of a dialogue about where are the opportunities to use your card, use the purchase card further. It's done at no additional cost, and it may involve multiple cuts or iterations of it. And one of the things that this accounts payable review might help identify is, particularly if you're in a large agency, you might have a certain region or location that's paying a vendor one way, and then in another region or location, they're paying that same vendor with a purchase card. So there's some inconsistencies in how that vendor is being paid, and your agency's missing out on refunds because of that inconsistency. The other thing is the accounts payable review will often identify vendors that your agency is paying who accept charge cards, but your agency is not paying with a charge card. Now, there may be some very valid reasons why your agency is not paying that vendor with a charge card. On the other hand, it may be one of those situations where the vendor or contractor is like, yeah, sure, we'd be happy to switch, no problem. So as I say, it's a beginning of a dialogue. It's an exploration. It's kind of a one step at a time kind of thing. It doesn't have to be a huge undertaking at the onset. The right players have to be involved. As I say, the contracting officers have to be involved. But you're leaving money on the table if you're not asking these questions. And so, this is where I think the greatest opportunity in SmartPay 3 for the agencies to get even more benefits out of the program exists, is if you're able to pay more vendors, in terms of contract payments with a purchase card or a cardless payment process, both of which certainly are available under SmartPay 3, then your agency is going to get more of those refunds back to invest in mission delivery. So what would the outcomes of this be? First off, you want to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that you're maximizing use of the micro purchase authority and the use of the cards to pay for those micro purchases. The accounts payable review is going to point to these opportunities where, as I mentioned before, you've got a contractor who does accept cards, but you're not paying them that way, so there may be an additional opportunity there. You may have existing vendors who want to switch or are agreeable to switching. And there's a solicitation provision in the FAR. If your contracting officers are putting together a solicitation that they can include that indicates the government's intention to pay under this contract with a purchase card. And there's a really interesting twist to the language in that solicitation provision. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But as I touched on, this can really be beneficial to your vendors, particularly small vendors, because of the cash flow dimensions and some of the challenges some vendors have in terms of getting paid on time. This will also reduce your agency's invoice processing load. Why? Well, think about it. Who's paying the vendor? Who's making these contract payments now? It's actually the bank, right? And so the bank, you could imagine they could take numerous invoices, handle them, and then how many invoices do you get from the bank? One, right, per billing cycle. So a significant number of invoices workload could be taken off the agency, handled by the bank. You're earning refunds, and then your agency just has to pay the bank, right? So those additional refunds that you would get out of this process, again, that's more for your mission. So I'm not going to delve a lot into, oops, pardon me. Let's go back. I'm not going to delve a lot into the language in detail, but I thought it was really interesting to point out, looking at this FAR provision, the underscored area, and I added that. That's not actually in the clause itself. They don't underscore that, but just as a teaching point, take a look at this. Payment by a purchase card may also be made under a contract that does not contain the clause at FAR 52-232-36, to the extent the contractor agrees to accept that method of payment. So even if the clause isn't included, back on this issue of accounts payable review, identifying contractors who would accept a card but aren't being paid with a card, even if the clause isn't in the contract today with that contractor could still agree to accept the card as a method of payment. And that's a really interesting feature of this particular clause. So here's some other language, and I just put this in here. You may want to look at it later or share it with your contracting officials about payment by credit card. Just again, in here for your inspection later. You'd be amazed how many people have actually not looked at these clauses. And they're actually, first off, they're easy to read. Second off, as I mentioned, there's an unusual feature to it in terms of the vendor can still choose to accept cards even if the clause isn't there. Now, if the clause is included in the contract from the get-go, if it was included, for example, in a solicitation, and the contract was awarded in that clause, and the government stated its intention to pay with a credit card, well, then you're golden. The government's going to pay with the credit card under that contract for the life of that contract. But again, even if the clauses weren't included, in the basic award, you have this option. Your contracting people have the option to pay with a card later. And I can see a white text box on my screen here that blocking a part of the slide. I don't know where that came from, but I apologize for that. We'll just keep moving along. All right. So talked a lot about contract payments, accounts payable review, looking for opportunities for more refunds for the agencies. What is GSA doing with this? Well, our administrator, as I mentioned before, wants us to drink our own champagne. So she's asked my organization, the Center for Charge Card Management, to work with other GSA organizations, and these are internal GSA organizations, to identify opportunities for additional use of SmartPay for the things that GSA buys for itself. So we've developed a project team. We're in a project plan, and we're meeting with key organizations that could benefit from further purchase card use, both for micro purchases and for contract payments. So we're doing the same thing internally here at GSA that I talked about you considering and working within your organization to do. So we're looking to see, hey, for all the micro purchases that are out there, are we using the cards to support those to the maximum extent possible? Maximize those refunds. And then in terms of contract payments, what have we got out there from an accounts payable review standpoint? And, in terms of vendors that accept cards that we're not paying with a card, let's go pursue that. There's actually two phases to our expanded internal use project. Phase one is focused on the existing plastic that we have out there. So the actual plastic purchase cards in the hands of contracting officers across GSA. And if this project proves successful, then we plan on a phase two, which entails back-end integration with our accounts payable system and our contractor bank for cardless processing. So, I know there's a certain level of manual work that contracting officers often have to do when they use the card as a payment method under a contract. Well, in the cardless process, it takes all that manual work out and actually integrates with the payment system. So if the first phase of this shows significant opportunity, increase in refunds for GSA, then it would make sense to pursue automating this process. And so that's what phase 2 involves. So we're really excited about the expanded internal use project within GSA. We'll keep you posted on that. As we're going along, we're documenting it, and we're going to create a business case that we expect to share with the agencies. It's also something through the SAPOCs, because there are meetings with the SAPOCs that our administrator has, and we'll be sharing information about GSA's progress as it goes forward with this internal project. Now, in terms of opportunities beyond contract spend, and in relation to the current crisis that we're all facing and many agencies are working to respond to, what are the emergency card flexibilities? Well, let's spend a few minutes recapping that. So under the Stafford Act, the micro purchase threshold increases from $10,000 to $20,000 within the United States and $30,000 overseas in support of declared contingency operations. Now, note that the labor laws still apply in terms of the wage acts, the service contract labor standards, and the wage rate requirements for construction. What I would know as Service Contract Act and Davis-Bacon. And so if you've been around for a while, if you're also a member of the legacy workforce like me, those are the names you know these wage acts by. These wage acts would still apply, even though the micro purchase threshold increases for these declared contingency operations. So also in terms of flexibilities, and this is not just related to emergencies, but we've seen, for example, one agency this year do an almost $13 million transaction on a purchase card. And so one of the questions that I occasionally get asked by agencies is, what's the maximum amount, assuming the spending limits on a card were adjusted accordingly, what is the maximum amount that a purchase card could routinely handle for like a contract payment? And that $13 million transaction I mentioned was a payment under a contract with a particular vendor who was willing to accept a card for that large of a payment. In fact, that particular vendor only accepted charge cards for payment. So in general, there's some preparatory work that has to be done with the bank before this would happen. But both banks, whether you're with US Bank or Citibank, the maximum amount for a transaction is just a penny under $10 million. Now, I did mention a $13 million transaction with one agency. It ended up that in terms of a transaction, the payment had to be broken up into two segments because of this penny under $10 million limit. But again, this is not something where someone would routinely have that kind of limit necessarily on a purchase card. I mean, it really depends on the business need. But if you ever wondered about what's the largest amount that we could put through a purchase card in a single transaction, it's a penny under $10 million. So in the current crisis with COVID, many agencies are looking for new sources. In some cases, the availability of PPE is a challenge, and agencies are aggressively reaching out to new vendors. Many of these new vendors may not have dealt with the government before, but are readily willing to accept purchase cards. So the cards are there to support those transactions, just something else that you might want to think about, or when you're talking with your field APCs, just be aware that the cards can certainly be a help when you identify new vendors to acquire products or services that are needed to respond to the crisis. So Concomitant with further use of the program for the current crisis is need to keep track of the spend that we're doing. We've seen this before, for example, with hurricanes and wildland fires. So in April of this year, OMB issued a memo, M20-21, that established reporting requirements. And most of that memo addresses other issues beyond micro purchases, but it does touch on micro purchases in support of the agency COVID response. So OMB asked that we work with them and our contractor banks to establish a micro purchase reporting capability through the bank's electronic access system. So, if you're with Citi, it's Citi Manager. If you're with US Bank, it's Access Online. And so we work very closely with the banks to do that. And there is a reporting capability within each of those electronic access systems for reporting COVID-related micro purchases. And remember, the reason it's focused on micro purchases is because if you've got a transaction that's over the micro purchase threshold, right, it's going to be reported through FPDS, the Federal Procurement Data System. So we don't want to have duplication of data. So what OMB asked us to focus on was solely micro purchases. Now, if you're saying, hey, within my agency, we're not using that reporting capability, and that may entirely be true because the use of this capability is an agency discretion. So some agencies chose to use the EAS for reporting their COVID-related spend. Some chose not to. Some agencies have cardholders identify COVID-related spend in the EAS, but they don't use the EAS directly to report micro purchase spend. Instead, the EAS hands off data, for example, to a financial management system or a resource management system, and then they use that other system to do the reporting that may be required. The way the OMB memo is written, if an agency uses SmartPay EAS for reporting, then we at GSA, working with the banks, will collect those reports monthly. We will consolidate them, and we provide the reporting to OMB for the agency. If the agency doesn't use an EAS for their COVID micro purchase reporting, they're to collect the data and be prepared to provide it when OMB calls for it. Now, as of the April report, we had more than $33 million in COVID-related agency micro purchases that were identified. So let's talk about some other news on the SmartPay program, just to bring you up to speed on a few other things going on that are significant. One is that the OMB Circular A123 Appendix B was revised. It was issued last fall in August, late August. And one of the things this requires is that CFO Act agencies submit their narrative and statistical reports to GSA and not to OMB anymore. That's to occur in January of each year. We have a smart bulletin that's covering that requirement. But even beyond that, if you don't know OMB Circular A123 Appendix B, it's really the touchstone policy on card management in the government. So if you haven't taken a look at that, you might want to check it out. It covers a lot of information on how cards are to be managed in the federal government. So multi-factor authentication. Getting a bunch of stuff popping up on the screen here, my apologies. So multi-factor authentication, you may already have experienced this. It's underway across the program, and there actually will be multiple iterations of this. You probably have seen this in other government systems, and this is where, when you're logging into the electronic access system, you actually have to obtain a code or password either through email or on a mobile device that you have to enter into the website in a particular field before you can complete the login process. And it's very important that we move to multi-factor authentication. because we want to stay ahead of the fraudsters and the bad actors who are always trying to break into various systems. We need to protect government information. We need to protect cardholders. So I know multi-factor authentication, or MFA, can be inconvenient at times, but we have to move this direction. And indeed, it's required by the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They're the government entity that issues policy and requirements on system security in this area. And so the SmartPay program has to comply with that. So many agencies have seen this rolling out already. Some of them will see it rolling out in the coming months. So if you haven't seen it yet, you will. I know, for example, on my TSP account, as a TSP account holder, I have to do the multi-factor authentication with logging in there. In your personal lives, in your consumer banking experience, you probably already have seen for some time the use of MFA when accessing your personal banking accounts online. So this is really nothing new. It's a necessary step. And so we'll continue to evolve this because the technology is evolving, because the threat's always evolving, and we got to stay ahead of the fraudsters. So you may be at a point where you see multi-factor authentication addressed in one way in your agency, say it's by email, and then later on, you're going to see that evolve to something else. And the reason you see that happening, or your cardholders are going to see that happening, is because of, again, trying to stay ahead of the threat here and protect the information. So Section 889, this is what I touched on as we were walking through the agenda. And this is a significant issue from 2 points. This is the prohibition on buying certain Chinese telecom and surveillance equipment. And so there's a Part A and a Part B to Section 889. And Part A became effective last August. And that involved vendors under contract with the government not delivering equipment that had covered or prohibited technology in it. And what happens is a contract modification has to be cut with those contractors where the contractors represent that they're not selling equipment that includes prohibited technology to the government. And so under the SmartPay program, overwhelmingly, we're not providing equipment to our customers. It's a charge card services contract, right? It's not an equipment contract. So the contractors, both US Bank and Citibank, signed off on those mods. And so Part A is already in place. So we've got that dimension of it. And then the other dimension is purchase card holders can't buy equipment with prohibited or covered technology in it either. And so we put some information up on the SmartPay website. It's been up there for almost a year, identifying who these contractors are and mentioning this, this prohibition. Now, Part B, which becomes effective under a month from now, involves any contractors who provide services to the government, but it's not limited to just their government business. If they have any services that they provide that make use of prohibited technology, they have to represent to the government that that they do that, and that may prohibit the government from doing business with them. And so we're working very closely with the GSA SmartPay contractor banks to work through this issue. The interim rule was just published. In fact, the pre-publication version of it came out just a week ago. So on the 10th of July, the final versions of it came out earlier this week. So about the 13th of July, 13th, 14th of July. And so we're looking very closely at that, working with the banks. And at the master contract level, working with our contracting folks and the policy folks at GSA, we will get that addressed. In terms of cardholders, again, there's that second prong I mentioned, that cardholders are not going to be able to buy services. And yes, this does apply to micro purchases. They're not going to be able to buy services where that vendor, anywhere in what they do, not just in their government business, but it could be in commercial or consumer business. If they use any prohibited technology, you can't buy services from that vendor, or your cardholders can't buy services from that vendor. So a lot of work going on there. Here's a glimpse at the revised website. It's really a beautiful layout, and as you know, we've got a lot of good content on there. So congratulations to my team for doing this work. A lot of the staff on Aaron Van Dagna's team were involved in working on this. And so if you haven't checked out the SmartPay website, it's smartpay.gsa.gov. I recommend that you do so. There's just a wealth of information on there, and it's even easier to access now. So just a really nice redesign that became operational at the start of May of this year. So let's take a look at the future of payments. And a lot of this future, I think we've already touched on, in the sense that from my perspective, agencies getting more out of the program is really focused on, in terms of purchase card anyway, this looking at contract spend, these accounts payable reviews. But it could even be as simple as just working with your cardholders, working with the contracting officers, and exploring with the existing vendors if they would be willing to switch to payment by charge card if they're not there already. So you can see down the left-hand side of this slide many of the available features in the SmartPay program, virtual cards, e-payables, non-interchange based government-to-government transactions. So for example, if an agency is buying something from another agency, say like training or radio licenses or permits or something like that, and the agency providing the product accepts charge cards, even if it's a significant amount of money, and you got to be aware of the Treasury Financial Manual restrictions on this. But new for SmartPay 3, this flat fee, non-interchange based G2G, government-to-government payment process is very low cost. It'll be something like $5 or $7 a transaction, regardless of the dollar amount. So as we move to the right, under purchase cards, we still offer convenience checks for agencies who need them. They're not a preferred method of payment. They're not considered an electronic payment method, so you have to be careful about the Debt Collection Improvement Act requirements for electronic payments. But we realize in some areas, depending on unique mission requirements, some agencies really have no choice. So the convenience checks continue to be offered. We have declining balance cards, which in some cases can take the place of checks. And that basically operates similar to a gift card, where there's a set dollar amount put on it. And then as the card gets used, the amount gets drawn down until it's exhausted. We have cards that are both reloadable and not. We also have foreign currency cards. That's not designed for travelers, of course, or people that are just visiting other countries. It's a purchase card after all, but it's designed for employees who are resident in country, and it helps to minimize exposure to those foreign currency conversion fees. So we have those available. We had those under SmartPay 2. Travel, you can see again, declining balance cards, foreign currency cards. We have the Tax Advantage card, which is a card to help agencies with tax compliance. A number of agencies have moved out on that already, but it's still in an early adoption phase. A number of other agencies are looking at this. And what this can help an agency do is make sure that, in terms of lodging taxes in particular, that you're paying lodging taxes when you should be and not paying them when you shouldn't, so that you don't have, you're not losing money that could be invested in mission in paying state lodging taxes when you shouldn't be paying them. And then fleet, we continue with comprehensive suite of fleet unique reports and also the ability under Tier 2 for telematics, which is a plug-in module that goes into the OBD port on a car and can provide some interesting data to help manage things like fraud or questionable transactions and things like that. So a number of exciting options there. And not every agency has taken advantage of those. So, you know, in terms of your future program under SmartPay 3, you might want to take a look at some of those other solutions that I just ran through. And here's something else for the future. It's the GSA Commercial Platform Project, and it's a new buying channel that's coming online. Section 846 of the Fiscal 18 National Defense Authorization Act require the GSA administrator to establish a commercial products e-commerce portal. And the idea is it would be implemented in phases. And what's interesting here is it was to be awarded to more than one portal or platform provider. And so purchase cards will be the primary method of payment. In this month, earlier this month, these contract awards were made for the commercial platform or the e-marketplace to Amazon Business, Overstock, and Fisher Scientific. Now, the internet address or the URLs for these e-commerce platforms or e-marketplace platforms, commercial platforms, will be announced in late July or early August. So they're not out there yet. And the original deployment of these portals will be in a proof of concept, initial test kind of approach. And so there'll be a handful of early adopter agencies that will be involved in this initial test. All the existing micro purchase requirements apply to the e-commerce portals. So there's some further mention of that on this slide. But what GSA is hoping to do through the portals, and the portals are not run out of my office, they're managed by another program office, but the hope is to make the buying experience easier. It's going to highlight things like Ability One products, small business vendors. There'll be business-to-business features that aren't available on the commercial platform providers' sites. Tax exemption will be another feature of this, and they're going to map the SmartPay hierarchies into these platforms to help manage things like reporting and things like that within the platform itself. So the other hope is that in these e-commerce platforms, that in terms of the prohibited technology issue that we talked to earlier, is that the what's offered through these platforms will be in compliance with the prohibition, so that cardholders, purchase card holders, can make buys through the platform without having to worry about compliance with 899, that'll already be taken care of. Now, the cardholder still needs to pay attention to that. The cardholder is responsible for what they buy, but the commercial platforms team is working with those awarded vendors to try and make sure that what's offered under them complies with 899. So if you want to learn more about the Commercial Platforms Project, there's a Commercial Platforms group on GSA Interact, or you can email them at the email address shown at the bottom of this slide. So let's transition and talk about travel a little bit. So as I mentioned, in terms of fiscal year 20, due to the COVID-related travel restrictions that some agencies have put in place, and other restrictions that have occurred, for example, at the state and local level, events getting canceled, increased use of telework, and so on and so forth, travel card spend was below, or is running below fiscal 19 levels by as much as 85%. As we're getting into July, that trend is moderating somewhat, but I don't expect that travel spend is going to recover in this calendar year. And so during this time, a number of agencies are taking a look at their program, their travel program, and trying to to take it to the next step while there's kind of a lull in things. And that includes looking at virtual travel cards and the tax advantage cards, as I mentioned earlier. Now, what are virtual travel cards? Well, it's a cardless solution that can act as a centrally billed account and is another tool in the toolbox in terms of dealing with things such as lodging taxes. So at the headquarters level in your agency, if your agency is interested in this, you can dialogue with your servicing bank, either U.S. Bank or Citibank, and talk with them about the virtual travel cards. One thing I think that's also another opportunity for agencies is that when we do get back in the office, looking now in preparation for that, at use of the card, the travel card for local travel. So the master contracts allow that. If you're a civilian agency, the federal travel regulation allows that. It's been in the DoD regulations for years. So if you're not leveraging the travel card for local travel, that might be something from a policy perspective at the headquarters that you want to take a look at. It provides some great data in terms of you get to see what the employee used the card for, and also it helps with increasing refunds that your agency earns, and again that can be used to support mission delivery. On the fleet area, as I mentioned before, we're seeing reductions in fleet below fiscal 19 by as much as 40%. There is some moderation that's occurring here during the summer, but I don't think it's going to recover to the prior year levels before the end of the calendar year. Touched on the telematics. That might be something you want to take a look at in your fleet program if you haven't already. And there's a little bit more information about that. That's under Tier 2 in the master contract. But at the headquarters level, fleet management for agency-owned assets might be something that you want to take a look at. So let's move into talking about a couple of case studies. And what I do here is I actually take real-world transactions that card managers have told me about and turn them into a teaching point here. And I really wish we were together in person this year. I greatly miss being with everyone, seeing everyone. But we are where we are on this. But this part of it is, talking about the case studies in person is, I think, one of the most enjoyable parts of this class. So I really miss it, but I hope you'll think about these things as we go along here and still enjoy it. So if you look at this transaction here, and we anonymize these things, of course, but an AOPC sees the following transaction on a purchase card, and it's $709 at Denny's. So this, of course, came up, their data mining system or the criteria they'd set in their EAS as a questionable transaction. So, what seems peculiar about this? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, why would you be spending $700 at Denny's, right, on a purchase card? What could you do to find out more about what's going on here? Because obviously you're going to have to look further into this. And as you would expect, and in most cases, you contact the cardholder, or your AOPC would contact the cardholder and say, hey, what's the deal with this? What are other things that you might do to figure out what's going on here? Maybe not a whole heck of a lot. The primary thing is to contact the cardholder, because it certainly does look peculiar, doesn't it? Right? Well, so what happened here is it was actually a legitimate purchase. The transaction was made at a purchase card at a restaurant because the agency was looking to buy hand sanitizer, and they weren't able to find it from their conventional suppliers, but they were able to buy it from Denny's. So this particular agency had a $700 transaction on a purchase card, perfectly legitimate, to buy hand sanitizer. Interesting. Let's look at another one here. So we had a contractor whose data mining system identified a questionable transaction with the American Bar Association for $234. Now, this was triggered because the one of the business rules this agency had created in the data mining system looked for the word bar in the transaction. So does this look to you like a legitimate transaction or not? And why? Okay. And what would you do as an AOPC or your AOPC do if they saw this transaction? Same thing we talked about in the prior case, right? Is contact the cardholder. What's going on here? What's the deal, right? Well, it's a false positive, right? There's nothing wrong as if your agency allows for bar exams to be paid for using agency money. It's picking up on the word bar and thinking this is actually at a bar that serves alcohol, right? But as you dig into it, as you pull the thread on it, it's clearly an appropriate transaction. Of course, if your agency allows that particular expense for a bar exam to be paid for with agency funds. So a little bit of fun there with a false positive. I want to congratulate you all. You've made it through the slides. I know the first week of the forum, we're going to have an online chat session that follows a Q&A session after this presentation. So I'm looking forward to your questions. I hope you'll submit some. And here's my contact information in the event you have any questions that we don't deal with, or you're looking at this session in the recorded version without the live chat afterwards. And also you can check out or send any questions to our central email box at the address shown there. And so there we are. Congratulations. You've made it through the course. Thank you so much for being with me and for everything you do day in and day out to make the program the success that it is. I hope that you've had a good forum so far and that the rest of the virtual forum is very beneficial for you. Don't forget about the surveys. We really do read them and pay attention to them. So just really enjoy the virtual training experience. Stay safe, and thank you very much. Have a good remainder of the day. Bye-bye.